Hi, Suzanne from Flatwearable Artisan Jewelry. In this video tutorial, I'm going to show you how you're going to do these soldered hearts. And we're going to show them to you right here. Alrighty, I'm going to show you the process for doing the soldered hearts. This is an advanced learning technique and you may find some frustration in the soldering, but it is definitely worth learning. Practice it over and over again until you get the method down because it really does make a stunning pendant. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to get started. I'm going to show you what we're going to be working on. We're going to make this pendant here. These holes were not drilled, but I'm going to show you how I created this style pendant here. So one of the things that you need to learn initially is if you want a long heart, you're going to need to cut at a longer angle than if you want a more stubby or short heart. Okay? So I don't think that there's any really hard, fast rule on exactly how to mark these. What I normally do is I choose where I want my first cut to be, and I use a straight edge and a Sharpie marker, and I will mark my first line. That's going to be my first cut. Now there's a couple of ways that you're going to mark the second one, and I'll show you both ways. One is you can line the pieces up next to each other, and when you get them even, you can mark a little dot where this line intersects here. Then you can move it over, and you can mark another dot where it intersects on the opposite side. Just want to make sure everything's lined up. Okay, that's probably the easiest way to do it. You can also make doubly sure that you're doing it correct by taking the line that you drew initially, lining it up with the edge of this piece of silverware that's underneath, and when it lines up here and here, and you can see that it intersects with the two dots that we already made, you're just going to draw your second line. This is called cutting on the bias, which is really just a fancy way of saying cutting at an angle. So we've got these pieces marked. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to drill the holes that we're going to use, because it's going to be a lot easier to drill while these pieces are longer than it is when those pieces are short. So we're going to go over to the drill press, and I'm going to show you drilling for these. So you're going to mark your pieces for drilling, and you're going to determine where exactly you want your pendant to hang from. You may want your pendant to hang just on one side. You may want it to hang on both sides. For this one, we're going to do it on both sides. So I'm going to use my center punch to mark where I'm going to drill the holes. Okay, and then we're going to go over to the drill press. Come around that way. And I've gotten to where I'm really enjoying using the center drill to do the holes for these pendants. It makes a nice size hole, but it also chamfers the hole a little bit and removes the burr automatically, so I don't have to worry about a burr and having to take care of a burr after the drilling. So I'm just going to line that up. Okay, now I'm also going to do that on the back side, just enough to get that burr off. Okay, and hopefully you can see that that makes a really nice clean hole with no burr. Okay, second one. just want to tap a little bit. You drill too far and then you've gone and made the hole much too large. Because the center drill has a small starter, but it will go to a much larger hole. So you want to, if you're going to use the center drill for doing this, you want to make sure you just do a little at a time. Okay, so now we're going to move over here to the mini bandsaw. This is one of my new favorite tools. And here I'm going to cut directly on the line. I'm going to have Haley get a nice good close-up of the cutting here. And we're going to take our line and we're going to line it up with this little slit in the plate and start here. We're going to go nice and slow so we get a really smooth, clean cut. Second one. Gonna turn it whatever direction makes you feel most comfortable if you're using the mini bandsaw for this purpose. Okay, now don't discard these pieces here because you can actually create additional pieces by soldering what I always considered was scrap. Alright, so I have my pieces cut now, and if you've cut your lines correct, you're going to come up with this. Now, with any method of cutting, most of the time you're not going to get an exact, perfect match that has no gap. And hopefully you can see that I have a little bit of a gap here. You'd have to cut a really super perfect line so you don't have any gap. Well, we're in this soldering, you have to have pieces that match up completely flush. So any method of cutting, whether you're going to be using the mini bandsaw, whether you're going to be using a Dremel cutting wheel, or you're going to be cutting off your pieces with a bolt cutter, you're going to need to make sure that your join is completely flat and even. So we're going to go over here to the belt and disc sander. We're going to use the disc portion of the sander, and I'll explain why we're not going to use the belt portion. The belt portion flexes, so when you press your piece up against it, you're not going to get an even smooth cut. You need something that has a firm back to it, so that's why we're going to use this portion. This is a ring clamp, and one thing, if you've ever done any of this work, any sanding work on metal, you know the metal gets very hot and you cannot hold it for very long. So I'm going to use the ring clamp, and you can use it on either end, and I'm going to clamp it in there, and this is going to be what holds the piece while I do the sanding. And I'm going to have that much of it stick out. You want it nice, straight, and even. You put the little wedge in and you push it in as far as it goes. We're going to be applying the piece against the wheel. You want to make sure you're as level and flat and even as possible when you do this, because if it's tipped down at an angle at all, you're not going to have a nice smooth flat cut. Alright? And hopefully you can see in here that everything is really smooth. If you don't have a flat cut, you'll be able to see it immediately because you won't have an even sanding from side to side. What ends up happening is you'll see a little space that doesn't quite look like the other parts, and that's because that space is not flat and even. So you need to do a little bit more grinding to get to that point. You're going to find that a lot more frequently if you're using a cutting method that is not the mini bandsaw. You're going to find yourself having to do a lot more sanding to get that smooth and even and flat. So I purposely want to create the scenario I just talked about to show you. Hopefully you can see in the video the difference. This has been sanded and this has been sanded, but this center part has not received any sanding. You can see, hopefully in the video, the difference in the coloring of the metal, and that is indicating to you you do not have this completely flat yet. When you get the metal to where it has the same coloring all the way across, you know you have a flat piece. Okay? It definitely takes practice to get a really nice flat piece. Now be careful because it's really hot. I've got some water here to quench that in because it's going to get too hot to be able to handle. So I'm going to check the fit. And you can see I have a nice good fit here now. No gap in the center. All right. There's a little bit of discoloration, and that comes from the heating of those little leather pads. They're going to leave a little bit of discoloration. You're going to be able to sand that off later, so we're not going to be concerned about any discoloration. So sometimes you're going to have a little bit of burring on the edge, and what I do is I'll use the fiber wheel and just hit those edges very lightly with the fiber wheel. That also makes sure everything is nice and clean. Okay, so now our pieces are prepped and ready for soldering. I'm going to be using the soldering tripod. I'm actually going to switch places with Haley because I'm going to have her shoot this from the other side, because what I'm going to explain to you is you need a very, very steady hand for what I'm going to teach you. And I find if I have something that I can lean my arm up against, I'm going to have a much steadier hand than if I just try and hold my solder free-handed. So this is probably one of the trickier parts, and that is you need to get your pieces lined up on the mesh on this tripod so everything is even, flat, level, and you have the tightest join area that you can get. Solder does not effectively fill in gaps, which is why you need that to be as tight as possible. Something I do want to mention about the soldering tripod, the screen that you get with that is galvanized, and that means that the steel has been dipped in a zinc bath. That zinc is going to transfer onto your pieces. Not that it's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you heat your area really good prior to doing any soldering, you'll have less transfer of that discoloration onto your pieces. And then you don't have to worry about removing it in the end. So, because this is mesh screen, it's flexible. So sometimes you may have to push down on it a little bit till you find that it's got your pieces exactly lined up. Now I want Haley to get in a nice close-up here. You can see I've cut my pieces off just a slight bit, and I have a little bit of a tip coming down longer than this side over here. Because it's just a slight amount, I'm not too concerned about it because I can always grind that tip down afterwards. Okay? So, I'm going to make sure all my two pieces here are lined up as accurately as I can possibly get them. I'm going to bring my water over this way and my solder wire. This is the solder wire that we carry. This melts at about 430 degrees, so it's actually relatively low in temperature, so it melts quite quickly, as opposed to jewelry solder, which melts at a much higher temperature and is something I do not recommend for using on silver plated items because the heat is much too high and will damage the silver plate. This is a solder pick here. You're going to find that oftentimes when you're doing this, the pieces are going to separate a little bit. You need to have something to be able to push it back together again. So soldering pick is really important for that purpose. We're also going to use a tweezer to take the piece off, and we're going to quench it. So what we're going to do here is, I've got my little torch. We're going to warm the piece from the top to start with. You want to give it a gentle warming for 5 or 6 seconds, not very long. We're going to be doing our soldering from the top and our heating from underneath. You want to make sure this is heated sufficiently so when you touch the solder wire to the join, which is the area between the two pieces, that you're going to get an immediate melt. That's going to take a little practice to kind of determine how long it's going to take. I can't really give you an answer because every piece is going to be different. So I'm going to hold my arm over here. I'm not going to take my heat away entirely. Just move it out of the direction of where I'm at. And I'm going to touch this area with the solder. Very, very lightly touch it with the solder. I'm going to come back up here. I'm going to finish off by reheating this area and warming the solder we just melted. Alright, you can let that sit and cool naturally if you like. If you want to move the process along a little bit faster, you can put some water on it. Now if your pieces have separated slightly, this piece is still quite hot. So you can actually take and push together slightly. You can see how the piece is moving. That's because the piece is still hot, so the solder has not completely set, which when you first start doing this, you're going to find very frequently that your pieces have moved and you're going to need that time to be able to put them back together. Alright, so I'm going to drop water on it. That's going to cool it down enough to where we can pick it up. Make sure it's cool before you touch it. And this is where we're at right now, okay? I probably should have let my solder cool down a little bit more because what happens when it's splashed, it's spread out. And a good solder joint is one that really hardly can be seen. So a lot of this we can clean up in buffing. Here's one that I did earlier, and you can see that the solder joint there's much less splatter of the solder. So I probably should have just allowed that to cool down a little bit. It's fine, it's on the back, so I'm really not that concerned about it. Okay, so we're going to go back over to the vertical belt sander, and I'm going to remove this little tip here that isn't quite right. Okay. And then the fiber wheel just to smooth that off. Now I also am going to take and I'm going to put the back of this against the fiber wheel to clean off all this discoloration. You can put a satin finish on your pieces with using the fiber wheel, or you can do a high polish. Okay, so you can still see the solder there, but it definitely looks a lot better now than it did when I first took it off of the heat. So we're going to take and we're going to polish this up. Now you can see some of the discoloration here, and that is from the screen material, and we're going to be able to remove that using the white compound on the bench buffer. You can also use the ring. Let me turn that off for a moment. You can also use the ring clamp if you're a little nervous about small pieces on the bench buffer. You can see it just pulls it right out of your hand. You can also use the ring clamp to do this work as well. And it gets hot, as if you keep doing it long enough, it's going to get hot enough to where it's uncomfortable for you to hold. So again, the ring clamp is good for that purpose. Okay, so I've removed the discoloration. Now I'm going to go over here to the rouge, and I'm going to polish that up. This is where your shine comes in. You can also put it into the tumbler after you have finished this, continue to bring up that shine. All right, let me grab cloth to wipe this down. Okay, now we're just going to remove any of the compound residue that is left over in the pattern. Okay. And there you have a completed heart. Okay, there is the front, there is the back. Like I said, this is an advanced learning technique. I know it may seem really easy what I just did, but it can be very frustrating, especially when you go to doing the heating from underneath. And those pieces, because of the heat, they want to pull apart from each other, and you're going to get a little bit of a gap. So make sure you have your pick on hand to push those pieces back together. The really forgiving part is, after you're done with the soldering, those pieces are going to remain hot. So you do have time to move them back together and to level them off. If you've got a higher spot here as opposed to here, you want to be able to level those off. You can use your solder pick to do that. Okay, we'll be talking to you again soon. Bye-bye.